quaking people? Count Richter Quake here, coming at you with my reaction to Sabaton History 61. Alright, I'm excited about this. This was recommended to me and donated for by Draconic Afterlife. Guys, if you want me to react to something on YouTube, there's a link down below for donations. $10 donation gets you a dedicated YouTube video just like this one. Alright guys, this is another Sabaton history. This is about the Vietnam War, the song Into the Fire. We've been talking a lot about World War II with a lot of these last few videos and how it was mishandled, and that's the reason they lost the war. We'll flip that on its head on America for the Vietnam War, honestly. Vietnam War, we didn't handle that very well. We didn't have a lot of support at home either. There's a lot of support the troops stuff here and now. My grandpa was in Vietnam. He said that you would come home and get spit on. You wouldn't dare spit on a soldier now. Back then, it was like they were hated. They didn't get the support. It was a thankless job back then. Vietnam was a big loss. This is it right here. The Sabaton History 61, Into the Fire, about the Vietnam War. Check it out.
You guys have written about very many different wars. The World Wars and Shirayama and the 30 Years' War and the Great Northern War. But you only have one song that's actually about Vietnam.
Yeah, Into the Fire.
It was the height of the Cold War. While the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in what was maybe the deadliest staring contest in human history, the real wars were being fought on the periphery of the blocks of power. The communist doctrine of national liberation was gaining traction in post-colonial Southeast Asia, and the U.S. government was fearful that a domino effect might push more countries into the communist sphere. U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in 1961, as Soviet and U.S. ideology split that country into two camps. The communist North began waging an armed insurgency against the Republican South. Despite President John F. Kennedy's promise to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese population, he also went straight to sending in special forces to train the South Vietnamese army. The insurgency became more and more violent, and American forces were dragged into a military conflict that gradually evolved into full-on war, a war that grew ever uglier. For the U.S. and its allies, warfare in the past had been straightforward and pretty linear. The engagements in the Second World War, fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and soon after that in Korea, had presented them with fixed lines and coherent battlefields. They took pride in the statement that they could fight any enemy anywhere in the world. The war in Vietnam, however, was to be the place where many of the traditional tactical approaches to war stopped working. It is often portrayed as the prime example of guerrilla warfare because of North Vietnam's heavy reliance on the irregular forces of the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. The Viet Cong's aim was to subvert the South by controlling the rural population, often through brutal terror tactics. They wore no uniforms, nor did they have standardized equipment, and instead preferred ambushes and traps to conventional warfare. The Western coalition faced an enemy that seemingly had no headquarters, who did not even try to compete with them for superiority in the air or at sea, an enemy that deliberately chose to remain elusive, who would not stand and fight, but shoot at them from afar and then run. While the U.S. could conduct devastating bombing runs deep into the north of Vietnam, their true enemy controlled the terrain beneath the treetops via a large network of tunnels, or he fled into sanctuaries in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. It was clear that the Western forces could not just stay in their bases and bomb their enemies from the air. They would have to conduct aggressive combat operations themselves to destroy the enemy forces, disrupt his logistics, and break his power over the rural population. The supporting Australian forces already followed an especially aggressive doctrine of nearly non-stop patrolling to control and dominate the countryside around their base camps, and the U.S. troops followed suit. The nation's countryside, however, was a whole different matter. From open rice paddies to tree-covered ridges to the winding valleys of the mountainous regions in the south, the terrain of Vietnam was quite difficult to navigate. The plateaus of the Central Highlands are way different from the marshes of the Mekong Delta, but it was the jungle that really defined combat in Vietnam more than anything. There, it came down to individual platoons, scouring the thick and hostile jungle, trying to establish control over the enemy. Inside the jungle, it was often eerily quiet. If not for the noise of helicopters flying overhead or maybe from distant artillery shells, there was very little noise. So movement would be reduced to a minimum, as every moving leaf or cracking twig could warn the enemy of their presence. With poor visibility, men could sometimes only see 2 or 3 men in front of them. In dense terrain, the platoons split up in even smaller groups. They moved slowly, covering each other. Trails were nearly invisible, overgrown with vines and brush. Every step, they had to carefully scan their surroundings, looking for moving vegetation or color that did not belong. There was this constant need for vigilance, as light and shadow could easily play tricks on their minds. In the thick, layered vegetation, the best thing for the enemy was to camouflage its position and lay an ambush. Being unwary for just a moment, letting your guard down just once, could be a fatal mistake. Of course, as I said, they were not only moving through jungle. The platoons could start out quickly, moving over dry ground, then suddenly find themselves crawling through an area of thick bamboo. Then they would maybe traverse the rushing waters of a stream or march through an exposed field of rice paddies, then forcing through man-high elephant grass, and all of this in just 1 or 2 hours of marching. Since the terrain was so diverse, it was impossible to calculate how long a unit would be busting brush to reach its destination. Daily stress from the constant need to remain alert was exhausting, and the few hours of sleep each night, in combination with guard duty, wore the men down quickly. Water was often scarce.
As a D&D player, you know about that.
And
who's got first watch, who's got second watch.
Also draining. Temperatures changed from extreme to extreme depending on the season. Either it was too hot and too humid, or it was too wet once the monsoon season had set in. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common among inexperienced soldiers, while mosquitoes, leeches, and snakes menaced them during the steady downpour in the swamps and marshes. Malaria, fever, dysentery, and diarrhea, and even trench foot were all daily dangers outside of
trench
combat.
foot is a big deal.
It was not surprising that the paranoia and the stress were often relieved with drugs. As for what they carried with them, since the men were out in the field for several days on end, they had to carry enough supplies and ammunition to keep them going. But resupply was often difficult and could only be done by helicopter, so everything had to be as light as possible, which is a bit of a balancing act. The Vietnam War changed the deployment of weapons as well. The standardization of automatic rifles like the M16A1 was a confidence booster, especially in surprise engagements in the jungle, but it also led to a higher demand for ammunition. Actually, ammunition had priority over everything else. Jungle firefights were regularly lost by the side that ran out of bullets first. Bazookas and mortars were usually not carried into the dense jungle since they were too heavy and unwieldy. Once the sun was close to setting, the men had to stay close together. In the pitch-black jungle, it was very easy to lose each other, and navigating the vegetation at night was pretty much impossible. Instead, they would stop and rest, and after it got dark, quickly change position once more. Sleeping was only possible for a handful of hours, as they had to constantly guard themselves and prepare their own ambushes throughout the night. And if the patrol survived the night and finally reached its destination, maybe a village or another populated area, it would investigate for Viet Cong activity. Vietnamese interpreters accompanying the platoon would question the civilians, trying to get an accurate assessment of the situation. But trust was hard to come by. A village was full of ordinary people, fishermen, woodcutters, farmers. It was impossible to say if the Viet Cong already had a grip on the local population. Were they sympathizers or just poor folk who minded their own business? Did they hide weapons or make booby traps? Also, the Viet Cong often pressed villagers into service as lookouts who would alert them of the platoon's presence. Then the Viet Cong would prepare their ambushes. It was not unusual to suddenly encounter the enemy on the trip back the same way they had come. Once spotting an enemy, the silence was broken at once. The point man would open fire, usually setting off a whole magazine in the enemy direction before backing up. The men behind would throw grenades or smoke bombs as the cry, "Guns up!" resonated through the ranks. Grenade launchers and M60 machine guns moved up to suppress the enemy, while the fighting would move to the critical flanks.
Man.
It was vital to bring the maximum possible amount of firepower onto the enemy's position. If they were caught in the enemy's kill zone, that was a death sentence. They often fired blind. If they were lucky, they got fleeting glimpses of their enemies. But even at close range, the vegetation could easily hide a whole platoon. Streams of fire,
scary,
highlighted by
man.
tracer rounds, ripped through the vegetation from the belt-fed machine guns. Grenades like the M67 baseball were pretty much impossible to spot and throw back in the dense vegetation. Once the enemy had too much and sought to break off the engagement, the platoon would leapfrog onward, trying to keep the enemy from slipping away. Immediately, the radio men would establish contact with base, relaying their position to call for support. If they were lucky, attack helicopters and bombers would swoop in, trying to cut the retreating enemy off and destroy them from the air. Napalm bombs were what was most feared.
This place, it's driving me insane. Napalm, it's burning us all. This fight, no man will live to tell. Within me, my blood starts to boil. Now ready to strike.
Napalm is like a more vicious form of a flamethrower, a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent like lye. It's a highly incendiary and sticky liquid that once aflames clings to clothing or skin like burning glue, causing gruesome burns, and since it's a fluid, it can also flood into bunkers and tunnels. Where the napalm bombs were dropped, the jungle was immediately set aflame. It burned friend and foe alike, catching both civilians and combatants. Not only did it burn everything it came in contact with, its violent reaction with oxygen also means it sucked all the air out of its victims' lungs, killing them with sheer pressure. The heat, the asphyxiation killed people even if they weren't hit directly. Napalm cannot be washed off and is an unforgiving, tormenting killer.
Wow.
Napalm became a symbol of the Vietnam War. But like the automatic weaponry, like the thousands of bullets and the tons of bombs spent on each engagement, napalm was just an attempt to catch the enemy. An enemy that did not care for instruction manuals or battle lines. Napalm symbolized the desire to kill an elusive and dangerous enemy by any means possible.
Wow.
I'm ready to strike. A creature of the night. Into the fire. The flame of napalm strikes.
I'm surprised they didn't talk about like the traps the Viet Cong would set.
So that's interesting that this is the only song about Vietnam. And this is one of your earliest war songs, yeah?
Yeah, it's from the first album, Prima Victoria, actually.
So how did this come about then?
Because at this time we didn't have a clear vision of where we were going with the storytelling, which battles, which war we would cover, and we also didn't have so much in-depth knowledge. So we would go for the ones that we know a little bit more about. Obviously, we have heard about, and where it all started was the Normandy with the Operation Overlord, and then it went on with a couple of others, and obviously the war in Vietnam. And
Well, when I was a kid, it was still going on. You know, I was born in the 60s, so even in the early 70s, the first like 7-8 years of my life, there was a war going on.
It's true. Not for me. I'm younger than you.
Young
but,
guys. Yeah.
But we were seeing a lot of it. We were growing up with the movies about it because there was plenty of them made, and also with some music about it. I remember one of my favorite songs from one of my favorite bands, Gravedigger. They have a song called Heart of Darkness, which is...
So the Joseph Conrad book that Apocalypse Now, the movie was based on.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of had this little
Read that in high
idea
school.
when we were writing the lyrics for it, like because there's a creature of the night, into the fire, now I'm ready to fight. These things, they represent some guy with a lot of anger and
Plenty of that.
and then the fire with the napalm.
With the napalm. See, it makes me think more instead of Apocalypse Now, more of the Deer Hunter with Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken. And Christopher Walken's guy, when he snaps and plays Russian roulette again and again, and he keeps winning, and it's. You can see just in his I mean, Christopher Walken's a great actor, but you can see in his eyes that it's heavy. And, they made a lot of movies. Well, not a lot. They made a bunch of movies that were dark about Apocalypse Now.
A lot and bunch are the same
One thing
word.
they didn't do,
right?
is, as far as I know, is have a comedy series about people in Vietnam. And the reason I say that is because From the Korean War, you have MASH, which is a comedy, although it does follow the war. And for World War II, there's Hogan's Heroes, which is, I mean, it's about a German prison camp. And that came out only 20, and it's happy-go-lucky people like Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz. They're like goofy Germans. And it's 20 years after World War II. And the same thing with MASH. That was in the 1970s. But we never had, I don't think there was a happy-go-lucky Vietnam thing. You know?
I don't know, but I guess because of all the negativity it created in America, nobody dared to
lot.
touch it, maybe.
Yeah,
Because World War II obviously
because it wasn't like a
created,
win, you know.
obviously World War II created a very uplifting
Sure,
emotions in
the
America.
ending, yeah. So, and Korea, even though that was never, you know, fully resolved, that was still more than that. And the napalm thing too, I really like that you got that, because that is for me an enduring symbol of Vietnam. Because that was always you'd see pictures on.
Yeah.
My dad'd be watching the news, and I'd be walking by as a kid on TV, and it was napalm, napalm, napalm. That's some scary stuff came out of Vietnam. They used to spray DDT in our neighborhood when I was a kid. You'd have to go inside because there'd be clouds of DDT sprayed in the. Yeah, that's poison. They don't do that anymore.
No, so for a good reason.
All right, well, that is Into the
Wow.
Fire, and that is it for today from us.
Thank
right.
you for watching the Sabaton History Channel.
See you next time.
Love these videos, man.
Listen to me, everybody. We love the Sabaton History Channel. If you do it, please share it with us. Support it on Patreon, YouTube, and any way you want. Thank you for your support. Let's do this forever.
Do it forever. Yes, let's go. All right, man. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, like, my grandpa was in Vietnam. I can hear a lot of stories about, like, you know, he has little fun stories about it, but it wasn't a fun time. Napalm, that was deadly, man. It was devastating. And my grandpa actually, he had an issue with his legs. He's no longer with us, but his entire life they didn't really treat well. And I'm not making any claims about anything. He said that it was because of Agent Orange, and the VA or whoever it was always said, you know, it wasn't Agent Orange, that wasn't a thing. It's not that. And then he had trouble up until he died. No, they didn't really treat it well. They didn't treat it properly. So yeah, Vietnam War was no joke, man. But they didn't talk about what are they called though. They would get like bamboo sticks. They would make traps, and they bamboo sticks stuck into like a trap, like a pitfall trap, and they'd have like feces on it and stuff. So you would get impaled, and then you get like dysentery and stuff, and you die slowly and painfully. There's a name for them. I forget what they're called. But yeah, man, it was gruesome. And Vietnam is scary because like you're fighting in enemy difficult terrain. Those of you who are D&D players, you're fighting in very difficult terrain. It's scary stuff. War is never fun, but it definitely wasn't one of like the proud look back moments in American history for sure. Like I said, it wasn't a win, so to speak. Anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this reaction, like, comment, subscribe if you feel so inclined. Follow me on all my social media, join my Discord, follow me on Twitch. Everything I do is down in the description. Come hang out. Until next time, guys, I've been Cat Richard Quick, and I hope you